So now that you know how to identify the inverse and the regular head and shoulders pattern, it's important that we discuss the actual reason for entry using this pattern. So let's go ahead and get started right now with the regular head and shoulders pattern. Hopefully you've already spotted this one. It goes like this. We have a push up to our right shoulder, a pullback. This pullback then is preceded by a new higher high. This is the first thing we need to see for a head and shoulders pattern. Our next step is that we want to see a pullback from the head that at least touches our termination zone, which is made up between the bodies and the head of our right shoulder. So with that being the case, we want to see price push down and actually hit that point, and we do. Next up, we want to make sure that we see price push up and hit at least the bodies of our right shoulder without going above the head of our right shoulder. And obviously here we have a valid regular head and shoulders pattern. So with that being the case, what are we going to do about entries? Well, the first and most aggressive entry is not going to be just a color change candle. This is going to be our termination zone. Our first and most aggressive entry is going to be a candlestick pattern for these types of trades. I know that in the previous video I said I needed to see price break through the termination zone in order to classify this as a head and shoulders pattern, but for the most aggressive way to enter this type of pattern, I'm using candlestick patterns like we talked about in the previous lessons. So that would be either the 382 candle or the engulfing candle. So in doing so, we would be waiting for price to hit this, then push up to our termination zone, and then create one of those patterns, whether that be the 382 candle, and let's actually see if we have one right here. This looks to be an accurate 382 candle. So this would be our entry, and this candle can happen anywhere in our termination zone. So for the most aggressive entry, we're looking for either the 382 candle or the engulfing candle anywhere in the termination zone for our regular head and shoulders pattern. So in this case, we have a good example of the 382 candle here, but let's say that wasn't a 382 candle. Do we have an engulfing candle here? Yes, we do. And does this align with the rules of our engulfing candle? We need to see a lower high, a higher high, and a lower high on the engulfing. So yes, this would align with those rules, and therefore, in terms of the most aggressive entry, it would look something like this. Let's go with our 382 candle, since that is where we would have entered this initially. That entry would have happened directly on the close of that candle. For head and shoulders patterns, we normally like to have our stop loss above the head of the pattern. At times, we will have less of a stop loss, but that is strategy dependent and something we'll talk about later on in the video. You could have your target set somewhere near the initial leg of the impulse leg that created the first right shoulder. But again, we'll talk more about targets and stops later on in the course. But that is the most aggressive way to enter the regular head and shoulders pattern. Now, other than the most aggressive way, the rest of these are very similar to the double top and double bottom patterns. So after we get a push up and we terminate somewhere in our termination zone without touching the top of the bodies of our head, then we push down. Our second most aggressive way to enter a head and shoulders pattern, and slightly more conservative way, is to wait on a close below our termination zone or a close below what we consider to be the neckline of this a neckline of this head and shoulders pattern. So that would be looking for a close below this point right here. So with that being the case, our entry candle would be this candle here that closed below, meaning that we would have an entry that looked like this. As soon as that candle closed, we would have that as our entry. Now, one of the benefits of the head and shoulders pattern is that at this point, we actually have a different swing high that we can put our stop loss above. So this is how I would place stops normally when trading the breakout of the neckline. I would have my stop loss above the right shoulder, this shoulder right here. With that being the case, this is a little different than the double bottom and double top, with the breakout version of this being one of my favorite ways to trade it. And the reason is because I can still have a tighter stop loss even when using this extra confirmation of breaking through the neckline of the head and shoulders pattern. So with that being the case, this is kind of what the trade setup may look like, something like this. And for our most conservative way to enter this pattern, it's the same as we had with the double bottom and double top. What we would be waiting on is our termination point right here, and we would be waiting for price to break through the neckline and then pull back to our termination zone, which is between the bodies and the lows of the entire neckline, and then we'd want to see a red candle after coming back to that to show us the market does have some selling pressure from this zone. So with that being the case, this would be our most conservative way to enter a regular head and shoulders pattern, and the entry would look something like this, entering directly on the close of that red candle. Stop loss either above the right shoulder, right over here, or you could make up a stop loss rule that's just above your swing high here. Again, we will talk about stops and targets later on in the course, and targets, we'll talk about that later in the course as well. This part of the video is just meant to show you the ways I enter head and shoulders patterns from most aggressive to least aggressive. This would be the least aggressive or the most conservative way to enter a regular head and shoulders pattern. Let's now move on to the inverse head and shoulders. We'll do it a little more quickly because this is literally just going to be the upside down version of what we just looked at. Here we're looking at an inverse head and shoulders pattern, and what we have is a market that's pushing down lower and lower. Then we eventually have our pullback, a break through that right shoulder. Then what do we have? Then we have a push up that terminates in the correct zone right here. After that termination in the correct zone, we need to see price terminate yet again on this pullback in this zone. All of that happens, right? So with that being the case, our most aggressive way to enter into an inverse head and shoulder pattern is going to be the bullish candlestick patterns that we looked at. So that's either going to be the bullish swing low engulfing pattern, or the bullish 382 pattern, which this looks like it is both of those. Or if we had a 1, 2, 3 engulfing pattern, it would look something like this. That would also be how we could enter this in the most aggressive way, which is waiting for this shoulder to be tested, and then any point between this shoulder and this, the head of the pattern, would be somewhere we could look for possible entries using candlestick patterns like we've discussed throughout this course. The two candlestick patterns are the engulfing and the hammer or slash 382 candle that we talked about earlier in the course. With that being the case, this would be the most aggressive entry. Entering at the close of that candle, we would then have a stop loss somewhere below the head of the pattern and then a target set accordingly. Now, after that, same as we just looked at, except upside down, the next way, or the next most aggressive slash a little more conservative, would be the candle that closes above the neckline of the pattern. The neckline of the pattern is the highest wick of the neckline, which would be right there. So that would qualify this as the entry point. At this point, yet again, with this, what I like to do is if I have an entry here, I'm not going to put my stop loss all the way below the head because I already have a swing low that I can put my stop loss below in this right shoulder here. With that being the case, that's where our stop would go, and our entry would be on the close of this candle that breaks out of the inverse head and shoulders pattern, breaks out of that neckline. After that, the next most aggressive way, or the most conservative way of entering this pattern, would be after the break of a neckline if we ended up getting a pullback and a green candle after the pullback. I didn't really find an example of that, but that is the other way. It's exactly like the regular head and shoulders pattern, just upside down. So hopefully that makes sense. We would just be waiting for a pullback here, and then we would be waiting for this zone, inside of this zone, for us to get a green candle out of it. That would be our most conservative way to enter an inverse head and shoulders pattern. So that's it. Look at the different ways to enter on head and shoulders patterns and inverse head and shoulders patterns from the most aggressive to the most conservative. We will be using each of these entries in different ways later on in the course as we go through the process of developing strategies that use simple chart patterns, but rules-based simple chart patterns in order to enter the market after a few other conditions are met. So hopefully now you have a good understanding of all the chart patterns we're going to be using. The next video will close out the Technical Analysis Mastery course. So let's go ahead and get to that, and I'll see you guys there.